It is a real pleasure to be welcoming all of you here today, both because we're in an incredible new space for us at Business School and because we're resuming this conference in person, and primarily because this is just such a crucial area for all of us to be thinking about. Climate change and truly our global response to that challenge over this decade and the many decades to come is going to be defining on every aspect of our lives, in the economy, every industry, from energy to transportation, food, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, supply chains, sort of every aspect of our lives is going to be disrupted, reimagined, and changed. And science is truly our compass in thinking and studying this phenomenon, understanding the phenomenon, understanding how to apply mitigation measures. Engineering and the hard sciences are here to invent incredible solutions and also amplify the ones that we already have in place. Policymakers at various levels need to do important work. Human decision-making is going to be crucial. Human psychology is going to be crucial. And I find businesses and business, the things that we do here at our school, to be agents of innovation and implementation at scale. So we're going to have to play a hugely important role into that journey. And the future of business will be transformed through that process, right? The process of transition. Now, I want to make a couple of comments about Colombia, which I assume most people know, but Colombia brings formidable strength in that area, both in climate science, in engineering, in policy, in the business school, in the newly formed climate school. It's an area where we have formidable strength and focus as an institution, and I'm pretty sure that we're going to have formidable impact both now and in the future. Our alumni, some of them here, are also changing the world in that space, and that's crucially important as well. So I sound optimistic, and I am, but on the other hand, I also realistically we need to radically accelerate whatever it is that we're doing. And I was thinking yesterday about how would that work, and the metaphor that comes to me, in part because I'm a sort of semiconductor engineer when I started many years ago, is that we need the sort of climate version of Moore's Law, almost exponentially amplifying our activity in different areas of the climate challenge. And I guess we plan to do that in this school. So over my pledge, or my plan, let's say, is that we will be doubling our activity every other year here at the school, and we're going to grow radically, both in terms of what we do, and in terms of people, and in terms of curriculum, and in terms of research, and in terms of our ability and our willingness to actually have true impact. Now, the purpose of this morning conference is to hear from business leaders and academics and talk about the transition to net zero, and what's working, what's not, where we are. And I think that's going to be crucially important. So thank you all for joining us. And now let me introduce our first speakers. Rich Lesser, friend, Global Chair of the BCG, Boston Consulting Group, will open the conference on net zero opportunities and challenges, after which he will be joined by Mark Gallogly, a graduate of our school, co-founder of Centerbridge and the Three Cairns Group, trustee of the university, and a leader here in everything Colombia, to talk about climate. So thank you all for coming. Rich, you're next.
So it's a pleasure to be here. Rather than starting off with the speech, if I don't know if you are like me, but listening to speeches isn't necessarily the most fun thing to do. So we thought, Mark and I just thought we'd just have a conversation together. I have a few charts I'll show along the way. So Mark, it's fantastic to be here. Where are we? We're still really challenged, is the honest answer. I feel encouraged by the progress we see on different fronts. I feel encouraged
by the number of corporate commitments that we've seen in the last 24 months, encouraged by government starting to step up. But I think if we're honest with each other, we're not where we need to be, and we're not on the path we need to be on. I've got a few charts I'll try to, I think this is I think the screen is off, that's fine. I've got a few, if you look at where we came out of COP, everybody was so pessimistic. Oh, is it there? Okay.
What we're looking
you go
at
to the
on
next-
that is, we're looking at ourselves, just.
Yes, which we
Which
don't
isn't
need to
that
see.
useful.
You really don't need to see. That one, perfect, thank you. I know this chart well. If you go into COP, the political, you and I were on the plane, actually, that's where we last saw each other, was on a plane going to COP, and
The commercial flight.
yes, for sure it was a commercial line. And one in which I left my suitcase on the plane and didn't get it to Glasgow for 2 days. I was stuck in Dublin, but that's besides the point. The going into COP, the view was so negative about where we were going to be. The politics were so dysfunctional, the geopolitics. I think that COP26 exceeded expectations on multiple dimensions in terms of the overall global agreement that we saw coming out, acknowledging the critical role of coal and fossil fuels for the first time, seeing multiple agreements, none of which are perfect, but all of which are far better than what we had on methane, on deforestation, on China and the US coming together for a joint statement for the first time, and exceeding people's, first time since Paris, exceeding people's expectations. But so you can genuinely say that it exceeded our political expectations in terms of outcome. It fell short of where we need to be, and that curve says
Now,
we're
where
on.
you're talking about now is where are we at COP, right?
Where are we on the path to net zero? Where
Okay,
are
so
we
let's
on
look
the
at
one?
this chart. We can't see the chart unless we turn around, but I think we got the idea. The chart says it's gone down in the last little window. What was that? That's COVID.
Right.
Okay, so one way to think about this is, Costis just said we need radical acceleration. As a consultant, you've looked at charts for years and years. You've created more than your fair share of charts.
Many more than my
right?
fair share.
Okay,
I'm way
the
overshooting.
line is going straight up. It bleeps down just because of COVID,
Right.
and now we can see it. And it's supposed to go straight down,
Right.
to get to a path of 1.5,
Right.
virtually straight down for the next 30 years.
Right.
Are we on anything close to that path?
No. I mean, you can see the blue line is if people hit their pledges, and you and I would both have some skepticism, the light blue line. If the pledges announced in COP were all achieved, where would we be?
Okay.
We would be in the low 2s.
Okay.
Where do we want to be? We want to be at 1.5 or well below 2. So it's hard you can't look at that and
Okay.
say we're on the path that we want to be on.
Jason Bordoff, who's over at the Energy Center, would say we're in the middle of an energy transition. Not. We're supposed to be in the middle of an energy transition. There's no indication that we're in the middle of an energy transition. Right? Costis just said we need to double, right? But does doubling do anything for us, really, in relation to this? What do we, double every 2 years? Double, I guess it means double what? But what are we going to do about this chart? How are we going to fix this direction?
Look, the only way to go faster is if we have many more moves by the private sector combined with much more support from the public sector. I do believe the private sector is getting onto a different pathway. I do see enough real things happening. And we were talking beforehand. I mean, if one would have said 5 or 7 years ago that the global auto industry would have made the kind of announcements from leading players, not just Tesla, from Daimler or GM or Ford or BMW. If we'd have said that 5 or 7 years ago, it would have seemed completely unrealistic, pie in the sky, and it's real. I do believe we're on that path. But do I believe we're on the path that matches to those green curves at the bottom? No. No, we're not. And the only path, I think, is to have continued focus from companies, continued accelerated efforts, and to have government.
What specifically do companies need to do now that they're not doing?
Well, first, they need to take the commitments that many of the big companies have made and turn them into action internally. That means accelerating progress on decarbonizing their own operations. And it frankly means a huge focus on what they do inside their supply chains. Because if you look at most downstream players, a tiny fraction of the total carbon that they ultimately are responsible and what they sell comes from their own operations. 85, 90% often comes from the downstream, from the upstream business partners that they have. The steel, the aluminum, the cement, the batteries that go into a car. There's all sorts of products that are very hard to make.
So companies must meet their pledges.
They meet their pledges and they focus more on their entire supply chains. That is the starting point. And then the third thing, which is not so much for this decade, but we need to lay the pipeline this decade, is unfortunately, we will not be able to reduce our way to zero. So we'll also have to build a removal economy in parallel to it.
Okay, let's break that down now. So they meet their pledges. You're not talking about a 2050 pledge, you're talking about shorter dated pledges,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And they meet their pledges and they think carefully about supply chain. Say a few sentences about what does that mean around supply chain?
So if you take most businesses that sell to consumers, that's at the end of the chain, what goes into their products is a huge share of purchased components and other elements. And those elements are often very carbon intensive to make. And those are the people that are really challenged and responsible for a huge share of emissions. And what's very interesting, I'm going to bop ahead. Can you go ahead 1 or 2 charts, please?
We have a total of 3 charts, don't worry. And
Yeah, it's only 3.
And we are going to ask you to ask
Sorry,
questions at the end
that
of
one.
this.
Perfect. Just stop there. The interesting thing about this is all work that I'm sharing with you. There's only a few charts, as Mark said, from our work with the World Economic Forum. What's very interesting is that if you take it from the standpoint of the end price to the consumer, decarbonizing a supply chain is not that expensive. The most obvious example is the car, the one on the left. In 2030, a car would roughly sell for 30,000 euro in Europe. It would cost about 500 euro or $600 here to make it a net zero car in terms of its manufacture. That doesn't sound like that much. I mean, what do you pay for a better audio system, for better wheels on the car? That's a very affordable thing. But if you take the individual component suppliers to the auto industry, the cost of the steel in the car goes up by a huge percentage. The cost in the aluminum goes up by a huge percentage. So the challenge we've got right now is the people who will control whether the decarbonization can happen at the company level don't feel like they can afford to do it unless they get signals from their customers that their customers value it, are ready to pay more for it, and can do it. But from those customers' point of view, the auto company, it's not an unfathomable amount of increased cost to be able to believe that you could do this. So we need supply chains to work together where the downstream players first say they're going to want measurements, they want accurate baselines, they want to know what's really going on. Second, that they expect rapid progress to be made. And third, that they're going to work together to make that possible, which in some cases means respeccing products, designing them better, and in some cases actually being willing to pay a bit more for some of the component parts. And that supply chain, and I used auto, but if you look across, these are 5 of the 7 biggest value chains in the world. So these comprise more than 50% of global emissions. And if you look at each one of them, what it costs to decarbonize the products are not zero in any of them, but they tend to be about 1 to 4% of the end selling price.
So a couple of things. One would be that this is all what it would cost if we do it, right? It meaning decarbonize. Of course, if we do not decarbonize, there's another set of costs. Right? Like
to the world,
right? So one of the challenges we still have in our heads is that we look at this is what it would cost to decarbonize. We don't look at the net of if we do not decarbonize. What do you think about that?
I think it's catastrophic, but it's catastrophic decades later. Do you know what I mean? Like the report in the paper, and I think it was the Times yesterday, about what share of ocean life disappears, but not in our lifetimes if we don't decarbonize. I mean, it would be hard to look at what that
I think this
report
is the
said,
one thing that
but
Rich
it's
and I
hard
agree
to-
like 95% of the time, but on this one, I don't think it's a decades later thing. I'd put a pin in that just for a second. I think it's happening like right now.
Oh, I think it's happening. I think the word catastrophe is one has to use with caution. And so when there are impacts, negative impacts on many people's lives and many species around the world that are happening much faster than that. I guess it's what rises to that level. And I think it's very fair to challenge, if you're the person living in a part of the world subject to extraordinary heat or subject to flooding, it's for you a catastrophe. It may not seem that in a
Or if
global
you've
basis.
spent about $700 million building 2 schools, 2 buildings, this building and that building, and I can see the river. You just really want to think about, like, what does that really mean? We're building an entire campus right on the river. Right on the river. So okay, so on this chart is telling us the cost, and your point is that it's not that much. This is a good news chart, you think?
I think it's it's a good news, bad news chart. The chart itself is good news, right? Because I made the team go back 3 times on these analyses. The first time they shared it with me, because I'm one of the authors of this report, I did not believe that you could do that. And then they literally took me through component by component in the car and what it would cost and how the thing worked. And I believe that this is, a reasonably accurate view trying to project a number of years out. The challenge is it is extraordinarily difficult to coordinate across supply chains, particularly when we lack the metrics to be able to do it, and we lack the economic incentives currently to be able
This
to
supply chain thing is really hot right now in the U.S. government, right? So the U.S. government, and Rich is a key leader, has been a key leader for years at the Business Roundtable. The U.S. government has now put out SEC guidelines that include Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 supply chain issues. Can you talk about, this gets a little nerdy, but it's an important part of what's going on in disclosure for climate and consistency of it. Talk to us a little bit about that, just for a minute, please.
We need, I believe, to make the progress at the speed that we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, to have a clarity of data and metrics and information that flows within companies and to the world. If you didn't, otherwise, how can you expect? I mean, it's the classic: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But this is as true in carbon as in anything else. And so I think you can debate who in government should be insisting that those measurements are transparent, because the SEC focuses on public companies. There's a lot of suboptimal elements that it necessarily be the SEC, but someone needs to do it to try to have some transparency. How to do it, at what level of detail, which specific elements, I mean, those are all subject to legitimate debate and trying to make it manageable. But there's no question in my mind that we want to have more transparency than we have, and we want it to be done in a reasonably consistent way, because that's how then different players can work together to try to make progress together.
This question of the SEC, the United States government, has come out with a 500-plus page report saying this is what we want to do. Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. The Scope 3 is really being pushed back on by business, saying...
Well, all the comments aren't in yet, but my expectation is many businesses will push back.
Okay, so the one thing to think about is when we say, this is like a personal opinion, that the private sector is all in. Rich didn't quite say that.
I don't think that.
You don't think that? What do you think they are?
I think the private sector is stepping up in a more meaningful way than it did.
Okay.
The private sector is not a monolith, as you know.
Yes.
There are elements of companies that are there, but this is a challenge for everyone. I don't think, at least in the US, I don't think either the private sector or the public sector are all in. I just feel like we're starting to get our arms around it.
So if let's say you're a young person at the Columbia Business School or a recent grad, and the company you work for is not all in. Like BCG seems to be more all in.
I think we are essentially all in right now. That is a true statement.
Okay. We're among the holy up here.
No, not holy. Not perfect, just all in.
but-
You still
but,
make
uh,
mistakes.
But if your company is not all in, what would you recommend to people? What should they do? How should they? You've been a leader for so many years in business, and you know the CEOs of all the biggest companies. What should a recent grad or about to grad do if their company is not all in?
So first, I just want to say, and I mean this sincerely, I think employees and prospective employees are probably the most important agent for change, at least in the business community that I see. I honestly feel like were it not for the pressure that employees were putting on, we certainly would not have gone as far as we have tried to go, and we are not perfect. I didn't mean to overstate. I just feel like we're really doing our very best to make rapid progress on many fronts. And I think that many other businesses as well. And I think the ability to attract top talent to your organization is viewed as the defining measure of success.
What
for
should
many
someone,
companies.
let's say...
So first, it should be clear when you're in interviewing, you should be asking, what are you doing? Are you serious? If you turn down someone and that's part of the reason you chose not to go somewhere, you should let them know that it wasn't the only consideration. Maybe it was location or the specific job. Don't overstate. Don't make it seem hyperbolic. But be honest that was a meaningful consideration. When you're in your organization and you have opportunities to speak to leadership in various settings, you should just be asking questions. Why do we make these choices? What are we doing to get better? What are we doing to help the business partners we work with? In our case, it's the airlines we fly on that are 78% of our emissions. So what are we doing to help the airlines that we work with get better, in addition to reducing the amount of flights we take, which is the most obvious thing to do, and we're working on as well. I believe that each of us can use our voice. And then some of you, because this is Columbia of all, after all, you're actually in a position to not just be asking questions and being advocates, you're in a position to be the drivers of change, to get involved in key initiatives, to think for yourself, because every company, I think, at least the ones that are pushing on it, are trying to do a combination of keep their whole employee base motivated, sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom, but then take the initiatives that will really matter most, that will really change the curve, and dig into those. And you want to be I would argue, depending on your own passions and interests, you should look to think about whether you want to be a part of those.
Should you organize within Goldman Sachs the clean energy team that writes a consistent monthly note to David and says, "Dear David, last month we financed XYZ. Why?" Should you be a more active employee? Should you think about, if we're facing the crisis that we just described and we're on the wrong line and employees have the most power, is it appropriate for people to organize within companies? Or do you think that that's going too far?
I think it's appropriate to use a voice to raise questions and to use a voice together to raise questions. I think that, remember, you're trying to make...
We want to organize former alums at businesses. This isn't what Rich just said, but might lean into that.
No, this will be potentially somewhat controversial, but I feel like young people using their collective voice, but it has to be done in a thoughtful way. The world doesn't change overnight, and you're looking to encourage people to take on bolder change, not to demonize them for not doing the most extreme things that you wish the world could be, because everybody operates within constraints, and that includes business leaders. So I really valued, it was stressful at times, but I valued when everyone from senior partners in the firm to our young people in Paris, where I had a meeting with the green team in Paris.
Thank God for Paris.
It was the green team in Paris who got really upset with me and with us, and I was in Paris, so it worked out well, and we did a session where we sat together, and I went through what I was doing. They went through what we thought we weren't doing enough of. They were in part right. I mean, it was 100% because I had views that they didn't have, but they had views that I didn't have, and a senior partner sent around a video to 1,500 other partners that talked about Paris, didn't talk exactly about what BCG was doing, but talked about what was happening in the world in response to the Paris Accord, and the honest answer was not nearly enough. And were we doing enough? Not were we doing nothing. No one was arguing we were doing nothing, but were we doing enough? And I would say the first time when you're the CEO and you see something like that, it feels a little bit like a punch. But then, you know, when you think about it, first I watched it a couple times, I concluded he was right. And then second, you know, it's then, so what can we do? Which may not be everything that people want, but it was a hell of a lot more than we were doing. And so that was in 2018. And then you try to sort of get things geared up. And
Just two quick things. One is, I put my phone down, so I don't know what time it is. Shanshan, can you tell me when there's 15 minutes left? No, wait, when do we end this presentation? 15? Okay, so we're going to open it up. We'll mention one other thing. Now we're going to open it up to questions from you for Rich. The two quick comments. One would be, Rich and I often talk about young people need to do X, Y, Z. This, I think, is too much pressure on young people. I think we should shift that it's really, if you're here, you're likely among the believers. Okay, but we have to figure out, how do we communicate within our own organizations broadly about this in a way that's compelling and holds accountability? I think that's a really important thing, both on an urgency basis, for scale, and for justice. We have to think about, how do we do that? That would be a worthy thing for the business school to really try to encapsulate for our recent grads and for our alums. Okay, opening it to
wait,
questions.
before we do that, there was one more. We didn't talk technology here.
Go for it.
And I think it's really important. Could we go to I think it was the next page? Yes. I just want to highlight, this was the work from this year that we did with the World Economic Forum on our net zero report. How much the world has underestimated how fast technology can progress. And when I look at a place like Columbia and the combination of the business school and the engineering college and the climate school and put that together, I really feel like technology has to be part of the answer. We can get about, depending on who you talk to, 50 to 60% of the way towards decarbonizing the economy with the technologies that exist today. That's what we can do. The last, say, 40% requires tremendous progress on technology. And you tend to read relatively conservative views about what can be achieved. So it's worth looking about what we have achieved. This is looking at three technologies, the three probably most important in today's world: solar photovoltaics, wind, and batteries. And it's showing how the forecasts evolved over time. And if I focus just on the solar one, in 2002, our projections for 2030 dramatically understated the capacity, how much solar would be out there, and dramatically overstated the cost. And if you look at it, it was off by a factor of 36 on capacity and a factor of 3 on cost. The numbers aren't quite as dramatic for wind and batteries, but they are very dramatic. And what does that mean? That means when leaders are looking at the future, they're looking at their executives sitting in front of them with forecasts that say, well, you know, I know you think we should do this, but look how slow these technologies will be to come along. And they understate it. So they don't quite meet Moore's law, Costis. They're not quite doubling every couple of years, but they are really powerful. And I think one of the most powerful things we as leaders in the business community and in the technology world can do is both have some confidence in the power of technology to enable us to make progress faster than we think we can, and two, to then try to be catalysts for those technologies. Catalysts in terms of the investments we make, catalysts in terms of the signals we send to our supply partners to encourage them to invest in technology. And from my end, I'm an engineer at heart, and I was trained as an engineer also, but I do see that as part of the solution. And so there's tons we need to do in the near term. We will not have the hydrogen technologies we need, the direct air capture technology, the sustainable aviation fuel. Those sorts of technologies will not be available to us at the scale and cost we need this decade, but the choices we make this decade to spur investment and to try to make it possible will be essential as to whether they exist in the 30s and 40s. And we, as leaders, need to do whatever we can to try to be on the forefront of those and a whole set of other technologies.
You know, BCG's got a whole AI group on climate. That's a quick example. We won't go into the details of that right now, but that's a good example of that. I'll give you one other quick one. Is anyone from Nigeria here, or anyone from that part of the world? Yes, from Nigeria. Okay, so in Nigeria today, most of the power most of the electricity is from diesel fuel generators, right? That's actually a significant majority of power. Today in Nigeria, that power is imported. They import diesel fuel, okay, at about 40 cents a kilowatt hour. 40 cents a kilowatt hour. What is solar today? What does utility scale solar today cost without batteries? With batteries, it doubles the cost, around 2 cents. They're spending 40 cents. It costs 2 cents, okay? This curve is crushing it, the relative to incumbent fossil fuels, if fossil fuel is generated with diesel on an import basis, and even if it's head-to-head. Because you see, that anyway, without getting into too much detail on that, there's only one reason that continues. And this isn't true just for Nigeria. Look what's happened in the United States. One senator from a coal state is stopping progress, in my view, on a bunch of things. So, but in that specific country, a country with 220 million people going to 500 million by 2050, by 2050. That just means you have to figure that out. Have to figure that out. Okay, opening to questions. Yes, in the back. Could you speak way up? We have mics. Yep. Yep, go for it.
So, for example, in the developing world, there's been a bunch of research by engineers that the upfront capital cost of renewable projects is usually double that of fossil fuels. So the issue there is, it is a financing issue, and so it's not that easily dismissible. When you introduce renewables, you usually have to upgrade transmission lines.
Yeah.
For example, if you want the kind of energy that you need to industrialize, not merely light up a small village.
Yes.
So I think there's a bit more
I couldn't
there.
agree with you more. The financing, absolutely correct in everything you just said. The financing in the developing world is an essential ingredient to this. Just take it big picture, just for 1 minute. The world spends $2 trillion this year on fossil fuel infrastructure globally. Exxon spends $18 billion on CapEx. That's a piece of $2 trillion, okay? How much do we need to do what Rich just described to get to net zero by 2050? We need to spend on average $5 trillion, okay? 3 extra trillion, of which 2 of those 3 extra trillion will be spent in the developing world, okay? How come? Because that's where we need to provide energy, which we currently don't have a sufficient amount of for people to have jobs, okay? And we need to provide that energy in a way that they can actually pay for it, which is your point. Who is going to pay the $2 trillion? It's in the United States' interest and the West's interest and the people who have put the carbon up in the air, the global North's interest, to help pay for that, or to pay most of it. I couldn't agree with you more. I totally agree, and I appreciate that clarification.
Thank you for that.
Okay. Okay, we're going to take 3 questions quickly and then hand them to Rich. Ready? Degrowth economics, yes. Next, Shan.
So, how to help supply chain and
How do you get supply chain into countries that don't have the money to create the right supply chain? Next. Yes, please. Degrowth, supply chain in the developing world, change demand.
Okay, so on degrowth, I think it's first of all, it's a very rich world kind of question. I mean, there are people hundreds and millions and billions of people who deserve the right to lead better lives and need economic growth to do that. And we need a global economy that provides opportunity for everybody, whether they're born in the richer countries of the world, the higher income countries, or the lower middle income countries. And then second, I think it's politically very challenging to be able to get there. So I guess I start more from the standpoint of let's try to build the technologies that will enable for continued growth and prosperity and opportunity for people around the world and still enable us to make rapid progress. And then a lot comes down to what you believe the opportunity for technology is to do that. if I look at the world we live in today versus 50 years ago or 100 years ago, I think we've seen the incredible power of technology, and I probably start believing there's more opportunity there. I realize there are others who question that, and therefore they come back to
So
the
we
answer.
need growth.
Growth.
We need growth. You're anti-degrowth,
I'm
right?
not a degrowth.
Okay, so how about supply chain and developing world?
Supply chain and development. Well, first of all, many of those supply chains run through companies that are in the developed world. When part of what makes me so excited about the supply chain opportunity is when the biggest companies in the world are talking to their supply chains, they're talking to them all over the world. And they're getting first just getting transparency of what's the data.
So
what's the
Walmart's
baseline.
supply chain goes
Touches
out to
everybody.
everything.
Yeah.
So if you decarbonize their supply chain, you
You
decarbonize the world.
decarbonize many other places. I think what will come back to your point is that many of those companies in lower and middle income countries will need infrastructure and the kind of things that you were asking about to be able to do that. But that'll then create local pressure because they'll be able to say, well, if I want to keep
How about
selling to
demand?
Walmart, if I want to keep selling, well, just one second, if I want to keep selling to Walmart or keep selling to someone else, then I have to decarbonize. And that will put much more local pressure to try to undertake these things. We absolutely have to solve the financing thing in parallel. On demand, I want to say two things. First of all, classically, demand should sit with government setting the right incentives. A price on carbon is the thing that many in the business community have asked for, whether that's a tax or an emissions trading scheme or other things. Or you can do it with incentives to purchase electric vehicles. Government always has a role in setting the ground rules. But I actually think this conversation focused a lot on commitment and a lot on action. I do think there's a third element which is critical, which is engagement. And in many industries, we need the players in that industry to work together so there's consistent labeling, so the standards are clear, so consumers can understand the choices they're making. Right now, it's such a cacophony of conversation about organic and green and low carbon. If you're a consumer, even a well-intended one, how do you possibly understand what's the smarter choice to be making? And that's where I think any individual player alone will not be able to break through that. But the auto sector could, the food sector could, the electronic sector could, and create some consistent standards so that consumers can make those choices and can understand what's in front of them today. So I put some of it on government, but I do believe sectors in the economy need to work much more closely together to make it easier for consumers to make smart choices.
Just 2 comments on what was said. You know, the average American per capita, what does the US use in power? Right? We use 12,000 kilowatt hours, 12,000. What does the average European use? 6,000. What does the average Chinese person use? 6,000, even though they have such a heavy manufacturing base. What does the average African use? 500. 500, okay? So someone's caused the problem, okay? 12,000, 6,000, 6,500. And on demand and on growth, these things are related also to efficiency and to all the other things that relate to what we just, thank God for the Europeans, because they will actually require consistent identification of the issues that Rich just said. The private sector in the United States will not support this, in my opinion. They will work hard. Some companies will, but they will not as a group. Why? Because it costs more money. Okay, and the SEC doesn't actually have the power to enforce it. You could talk more about that, but they really don't.
Can I end on one last, because I know we're out of time. Can I just end with one slide that I think people will, it's a positive slide. So that's can you switch to the last one and then that's it. Companies should be focused on sustainable competitive advantage. That was the origin of BCG. That is why BCG exists as an enterprise, but that is also a fundamental part of what I think is a part of every business school education. Increasingly, it is clear that companies that are leading in climate are finding ways to turn it into competitive advantage. And the best thing we can hope for, and in all our work try to do, is to create a clear and clear understanding that competitive advantage increasingly depends on being a leader in climate. And in one level, it's obvious, to Mark's earlier point, if the world's going to spend $3 to $5 trillion a year decarbonizing, would you rather, as a company, be guiding your strategy to be aligned with that tailwind, or would you rather be guiding your strategy to fight that headwind? At that level, it's pretty obvious that you should get behind it, but it's hard to see it, particularly in the early part of any S-curve. But then when we looked at it last year on multiple dimensions, you could see how it was playing out in terms of attracting talent, which we discussed earlier, in terms of aligning yourself with the product sectors within the products within your sector that are growing faster, in terms of the fact that actually about the first half of the carbon you need to take out in your enterprise actually doesn't have much or any incremental cost. Eventually it gets very costly, but parts do not. In terms of aligning with regulations and where regulations are going, in terms of accessing cheaper financing, and then, though it is correlation, not causality, you see it in terms of the shareholder returns as well. So I just want to highlight, it's easy in a conversation like this to think about it as all being a burden on companies to get on this journey, but I actually think what many leading companies are realizing is the real risk is to stick to your legacy businesses, ignore the trends that are coming, hope that you'll be able to resist, and eventually be viewed as falling behind. And the story that I often use when I'm talking to CEOs is just think about an S-curve. When you feel like you're a year behind on the bottom flat part of the S-curve, it doesn't feel like that big a deal. If anything, it feels like, oh, they're spending all this money and there's no advantage. As soon as the S-curve gets really steep, that year or year and a half feels like forever in terms of growth and investment capacity and market momentum and the ability to attract talent and capital. And so I think that part of what we need to do is also help companies, whether we're working in them, supporting them as clients, or in the roles we play in society, to realize this isn't just the right thing to do for society, this is the right thing to create a thriving, sustainable business for years to come.
Rich Lesser.